1951, in this shack made of U.S. Army ration boxes, Moon established his first church. After the Korean War ended, several young military officers, including one named Bo-hee Pak, converted to the new Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity. As the 50s ended, Moon and his missionaries left Korea to spread their faith. Their earliest success came in Japan. There, the church made political alliances and quickly established itself as much more than a religious movement.
1960 really represents the founding moment of the Moon organization as a political entity. You can think of the...
Daniel Junis is the author of Moon Rising, a forthcoming history of the Unification movement.
But now, grafted onto that, you began to have a whole set of political operations. And this is where Moon really developed his theocratic ideology, where politics would be married to religion.
1960 was a pivotal moment in U.S.-Asian relations. The Japanese and American governments signed a treaty allowing the Americans to maintain military bases in Japan and providing the Japanese access to America's capital and technology.
The signing today of the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security between Japan and the United States is truly a historic occasion.
The pact also allowed American forces in Japan to be equipped with nuclear weapons.
In Japan, left-wing political and labor organizations step up the tempo of their protests against the Japanese...
Thousands stormed the gates of the Japanese parliament, enraged at the military concessions to the Americans. Japanese business and political leaders moved to quell the unrest as brigades of right-wing students staged counter-demonstrations. Sun Myung Moon's Japanese followers soon took to the streets as political activities on behalf of conservative business interests became central to the Unification movement. When Moon's missionaries came to America in the 60s, their activities centered on Capitol Hill and college campuses.
When Moon came to the United States, his organization would play much the same role in American society that it was already playing in Japan and South Korea. During the Vietnam War, Moon worked to build a right-wing student movement as a counterweight to the left-wing student movement that was objecting to American military involvement in Vietnam.
And in America, as he had in Japan, Moon began to move among the political elite, from Dwight Eisenhower to Strom Thurmond to Richard Nixon. Moon has glad-handed and corresponded with an astonishing array of political figures. Moon sought to influence the American political agenda by pouring more than $1 billion into media.
Moon looked on the media as almost the nervous system for a global empire.
In the 1970s, Michael Warder became one of the most important Americans in the Unification movement. Warder says he had close contact with Moon for 6 years.
Well, Moon was the brain, and the media are to be, or were to be, the communications vehicle for his body politic surrounding the globe.
Warder was responsible for managing News World, Moon's daily newspaper in New York City.
Moon wanted total control of the media, so there would be no independent media with journalistic integrity. It would be a media totally loyal to Moon.
In 1977, Minnesota Democrat Donald Frazier launched the so-called Koreagate investigation, in part a probe into Moon's relationship to the Korean CIA and the buying of political influence on Capitol Hill. Using its own media, Moon's organization struck back in an all-out effort to discredit Fraser.
Mr. Fraser follows a far leftist political line and is a well-known opponent of the Korean government. For him, Koreagate was a golden opportunity.
One of Moon's media weapons was this film, Truth is My Sword. Moon's aide, Bo Hee Pak, led the charge.
What if you are an agent of influence for Moscow here on Hill? If these things are true, then the government of the United States is itself in grave danger. America's very survival and the security of the free world are at stake.
Moon wanted a whole series of articles going after poor Congressman Fraser, who was heading up the congressional investigations there. And so we would assign reporters to try and dig up all the dirt we could find on Congressman Fraser. And of course I would say to Moon, I said, well, on the one hand, we're supposed to be doing this, but on the other hand, we're competing with the New York Times, and so there's matters of credibility here. And he would, would bluster and get angry at these kinds of things and say, just do what I'm, ordering you to do, and don't ask so many questions and that sort of thing. And of course, Colonel Pak would reinforce these messages from Moon.
I cannot help but believe that you are being used as instrument of devil. You, yes, instrument of the devil. I said it. Who else would want to destroy a man of God but the devil?
I didn't appreciate the accusations they were making against me. They were absolutely false. I think they knew they were false.
Donald Fraser is now the mayor of Minneapolis.
The fact that they would make them in a public forum like that, I was really totally turned off and disgusted.
And so history might remember Donald Fraser, if it remembers him at all.
The Fraser subcommittee investigation, in fact, in a strange way, helped the movement, because for members, it became this cosmic struggle of good against evil, of God against Satan.
Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
From the standpoint of the members, it was Jesus taking on the Roman Empire. It was big. It was cosmic.
The Fraser Committee's final report said Moon was the key figure in an international network of organizations engaged in economic and political activities. The committee uncovered evidence that the Moon organization had systematically violated U.S. tax, immigration, banking, currency, and Foreign Agents Registration Act laws. It also detailed how the Korean CIA paid Moon to stage demonstrations at the United Nations and run a pro-South Korean propaganda effort. Michael Hirschman was the Fraser Committee's chief investigator.
I think we determined that their primary interest, at least in the United States at that time, was not religious at all, but was political. It was an attempt to gain power and influence and authority.
The Fraser Committee recommended that the White House form a task force to continue to investigate Moon. That never happened. By the time Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, the idea of investigating Sun Myung Moon's political activities was a dead issue. Ronald Reagan's presidency was hailed as the beginning of a conservative revolution. Activists from all over the United States came to the nation's capital. Ironically, with the revolution seemingly won, traditional sources of money for conservative politics, such as direct mail fundraising, began to dry up. But Moon, a VIP guest at the inauguration, soon became a major funder of Washington's new conservative establishment. Brent Bozell was one of the young Reagan revolutionaries.
When the Moonies entered the political scene in the early 1980s, one school of thought said that they were a good organization and that because of their anti-communist commitment, conservatives ought to work with them.
David Finzer was another conservative activist who came to Washington in the early 80s. Finzer says he took more than $400,000 from the Moon organization. He recalls one project the money paid for.
When the left would run an anti-South Africa campaign, we'd run an anti-Soviet campaign. We'd say, okay, you want to disinvest from South Africa? Fine, let's also disinvest from the Soviet Union. And it was a pretty successful campaign. We did some neat stuff. They'd build shanty towns, we'd build gulags around them.
Moon's most expensive political project was a newspaper, the Washington Times.
Washington is the most important single city in the world. If you can achieve influence, if you can achieve visibility, if you can achieve a measure of respect in Washington, then you fairly automatically are going to achieve these things in the rest of the world. There is no better agency or entity or instrument that I know of for achieving power here or almost anywhere else than a newspaper.
The Washington Times had an immediate impact. The President of the United States, seen here with Times President Bo-Hee Pak, said it was the first paper he read in the morning.
Moon had money, and he was willing to spend it.
Paul Weyrich, a co-founder of the Moral Majority, refuses to take Moon's money, but he hails Moon's newspaper as an antidote to its liberal competitor, the Washington Post.
The Washington Post became very arrogant, and they just decided that they would determine what was news and what wasn't news, and they wouldn't cover a lot of things that went on. And the Washington Times has forced the Post to cover a lot of things that they wouldn't cover if the Times wasn't in existence.
From Washington,
soon Washington Times columnists found even greater exposure on television.
On the right, Pat Buchanan. Tonight, the propaganda war.
If the Washington Times did not carry the conservative columnists that they carry, like a Pat Buchanan, like a Bill Rusher, like a Mona Sharon, I wonder if the television community would be aware of them and would tap them to use them in television.
By 1984, despite his paper's growing influence, James Whalen was unhappy.
When we started the paper, there was never any question that it would in any fashion project the views or the agenda of Sun Myung Moon or the Unification Church. All to the contrary. We said, look, we're going to put a high wall in place. It's going to be a sturdy wall, and it will divide us from you.
But Whalen's wall of editorial independence was often breached.
Moon himself gave direct instructions to the editors of who, in fact, calls the shots. Ultimately, Moon calls the shots. The Washington Times has become a Mooney newspaper. Number one and number two.
Whalen resigned. Times spokesman said the dispute was really over money. Whalen was later replaced by former Newsweek editor Arnaud de Bourgrave, seen here in a Moon-sponsored film.
When I was in Europe recently, I was delighted to hear the Washington Times quoted every hour, on the Voice of America and on the BBC, two worldwide radio networks that happen to reach hundreds of millions of people.
De Bourgrave has consistently denied taking orders from Moon, but the man who ran the editorial pages under de Bourgrave tells a different story. William Cheshire.
I protested to de Bourgrave. I went up to his office when I saw this happening and told him this was unethical, improper, unprofessional, and ought to stop. Also was dumb.
Cheshire and four others resigned after de Bourgrave ordered an about-face on an editorial critical of the South Korean government.
And told him, I said, Arno, we have a problem. He said, what's the problem? I said, the problem is you have conferred with the owners of this newspaper, come back downstairs and demanded a reversal of editorial policy on their say-so.
Questions about foreign control of the Washington Times have persisted for years. Other journalists, including Lars Erik Nelson of the New York Daily News, have called for a Justice Department investigation to determine if the Times violates the Foreign Agents Registration Act.
And the Justice Department doesn't seem to want to know. And I've never gotten a clear answer from them as to why they don't want to know.
What have they told you?
They said, that's an interesting point. They say, we'll think about that. And they never get back to me.